Now, when I told you that I love Russian girls, let's talk about the girls, because there's one interesting thing about Russia, and that is women outnumber men. As a matter of fact, they say that there are about 9 million more women to men in the entire country. Studies have shown that to 100 women, there is approximately 86.8 men. And the reason for this is partly due to the Second World War. But it's not just war that makes men's population low, it's also alcohol. Alcohol is predominantly a major problem with deaths with young men in the country. And although 52% of Russian women view alcohol as a major problem, a 2005 study showed that 37% of males would die before the age of 55 due to alcohol-related deaths. Now let's get off the bad topics and move on to some of the more positive things about Russia. One thing for sure is that Russia has a great population of 146 million people, with over 3/4 of its population living in cities such as Moscow and the beautiful St. Petersburg and so on. And some people might think that with Russia's size, it is the country with the smallest population density. But actually, if you spread everyone out, they do manage to have 21 people per square mile, compared to Greenland, which is like nothing. 0. Now, when we talk about density, let's be real, Russia is huge. As I stated earlier, it is the largest country in the entire world, with a landmass of over 17,075,200 square kilometers, which makes up almost the landmass of Canada and the United States combined. But with all this land, it has a lot of forest, and because of that, Russia is sometimes called the lungs of Europe. And therefore, the Russian forests are second to the Amazon rainforest when it comes to their trees consuming carbon dioxide. Also interesting thing about the land is it has a lot of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The country has over 26 of them, but one of the most amazing sites is the volcanoes of Kamchatka, which is a collection of 160 volcanoes with 29 of them being extremely active. And as for the ones that are alive, they are considered the largest active volcanoes in the Northern Hemisphere, and it is really quite an amazing spectacle. The scientists of Russia have done some amazing accomplishments, but one thing that Russian scientists have done that they can claim 100% theirs is they have the oldest plant ever to be regenerated from the seeds from over 32,000 years ago. This is the Selene stentophyllum, and although it was frozen in permafrost for such a long time, scientists managed to bring this plant back to life from its fruit tissues. Now here on FTD Facts, we also like to talk about some of the imports and exports of these countries. And Russia, for example, has over $449 billion in exports, and imports $295 billion in goods, with the biggest export being crude petroleum making 35%, and refined petroleum making 20%. And because of those numbers, they are the second biggest exporter of oil in the entire world. But their biggest imports are cars, making up 5.3%. In Russia, you will also notice that it has beautiful landmarks. We're not talking just about its architecture and buildings, we're also talking about its statues. But one of the most famous is the statue of the worker and the Kolkai woman, done by Vera Mokina. It is a stainless steel statue that is 80 feet high. And although it is now located in Moscow, it was first introduced at the World's Fair in 1937. And the statue alone was a significant visual of the war against Nazism during the Second World War, as the statue was placed opposite of the German Nazi flag to show their rivalry. Now, to talk about accomplishments within this country, we cannot forget about the Russian space program. But what makes the space program groundbreaking is it was the first program to send a man into space and to even orbit the Earth. That cosmonaut was Yuri Gagarin, and he launched from Earth in his Vostok space capsule on April 12, 1961. And because of that crowning achievement, the Russian space program has become one of the most influential space programs in the world, collaborating with scientists all over the globe. Now, with a big country and territory comes a big army. Russia's army comes in 5th over the world with over 1 million people in active service and 2 million people in reserve service as of 2017. And that army costs around $69 billion a year. And when it comes to military, we unfortunately have to talk about its nuclear arsenal. Maybe not one of the most proud things for a country to have, but here on FTD Facts, we talk about the good and the bad. But in 1988, it was reported that Russia at one point had over 45,000 warheads, with over 715 detonations. But however, since then, there's been major steps in decommissioning these deadly warheads and nuclear vessels. But currently, right now, it is estimated that Russia has over 7,000 nuclear warheads. But moving back over to achievements of Russia, the country has many of them. It's a country of great intelligence due to its over 600 universities. And because of its great education, Russia has earned 27 Nobel laureates, spreading across literature, chemistry, physics, and above all, peace.
Я понимаю ее как поклон.
Now with that in mind, let's talk about one very interesting fact about the Museum of St. Petersburg, which is called the Hermitage. This is one of the most famous museums in all of Russia. It's actually one of the oldest and largest museums in the entire world. Being built back in 1754 by Catherine the Great, it didn't actually open to the public until 1852, almost 100 years later. And it is a culmination of how Russians preserve not only their culture of beauty, but culture of knowledge and literature. But one thing that's funny about this museum is it's not just the knowledge and art that's inside, but it's the fact that this museum has currently 74 cats living in the museum to fight off rodents. Sounds like a good idea to take care of pests. And speaking about literature, well, we gotta talk about literature because some of you guys were like, hey man, you gotta talk about the literature of Russia because, well, Russian literature is, well, world renowned. And it's not just impressive and very good, but it's also vast. And just to skim the surface of it all started way back in the Middle Ages around the 10th century. But by the 1830s, it had grown and flourished, and as a matter of fact, that is when they called it the golden age of Russian literature. This was Russian Romanticism, and it was amazing. It was brought on by poetic talents like Vasily Zudkovsky, and let's not forget the first Russian novelist, Nikolai Gogol, who's even had his face put on stamps. Now, in our last video, we did talk about the alcohol issue, and some of you guys were like, Dave, you're not absolutely right. For example, Boris DuPont said that there hasn't been a problem with it since 2007. Thanks for giving us that information, and just because that, we're gonna actually dive deeper into the alcohol issue. So in Russia, they say that alcohol is a huge problem, but in 2008, suicide claimed over 38,000 lives. Now, their experts do say that alcohol contributed to half of those suicides. However, in 2010, President Dmitry Medvedev doubled the minimum price of alcohol to combat this problem. However, in 2014 and 15, the state proposed to drop that because of the financial crisis. And in 2016, 49 people died in Irkutsk from methanol poisoning. And this had Prime Minister Medvedev calling out for a ban of non-traditional alcoholic liquids. In 2011, the World Health Organization reported that the annual per capita consumption was 15.75 liters, making it the fourth highest European country to drink. But however, they are striving to take care of the problem, and even some areas in Russia are actually really focusing on it. But Russia isn't just great for its people committing to being bigger and better within themselves. It's also impressive for its landscape. It is vast and huge. For example, the Caspian Sea. She's big. Actually, some people consider it to be the biggest lake on the planet, stretching over 371,000 square kilometers. But what's funny about this sea is we are always under the implication that sea level is constant throughout the entire planet. But that is not really true because the Caspian Sea shores are at negative 28 meters below sea level. Russia, always gotta do something different. Now, of course, Russia has a completely different language. As a matter of fact, it's one of my favorite languages. And Russian is the 5th most spoken language throughout the planet. But one thing that's interesting about the Russians is their alphabet. They don't use our type of alphabet. The Cyrillic alphabet is very different, and it's considered one of the newest alphabets in the world. And although it was first introduced in the 9th century by the Bulgarian Empire at the Peslav Literacy School, the modern version of it didn't come in till about 1708. And even in 1919, the alphabet was threatened to be replaced by the Latin alphabet in order for them to become more westernized, but it looks like they stuck with their tradition. Also, in our last video, we talked about the volcanoes of Kamchatka, one of the most impressive volcano stretches in the entire world. But in Russia alone, they have 12 active volcanoes volcanoes. And to give you an update on the Kamchatka region, in the last 275 years, it has had 50 major eruptions. So when we talk about Russian culture, let's be real, we can't forget about the Nutcracker. You guys might have seen it, I know I've seen it, and we all know the dance from the Nutcracker. Well, actually, the dance in Tchaikovsky's famous ballet is based off a Ukrainian traditional and aerobic dance. It's called the Tripek, and as a matter of fact, Russia has over 10 different traditional formal dances that are known throughout the world. And considering we're talking about ballet, well, it's a huge thing in Russia, it was a huge thing in Paris, but why did it become so big in Russia? We all know Russians are great dancers, and although ballet originated in France, one of the most important theater groups at the time of the initial height of ballet was the National Opera of Ukraine, which had an opera company in 1867 in Kiev. And although it was a small company, by 1893 they were capable of putting on large-scale ballets. And that theater alone was one of the contributing factors to ballet becoming such a traditional thing. Now, with Russia being so vast and huge, you need transportation to get from one side of Russia to the other. And in the 1800s, one of the fastest ways to get from point A to B was the railway, and I'm talking about the Trans-Siberian Railway. Starting in Moscow, going all the way east to Vladivostok, it is the longest railway in the entire world. And it comes in at a total 9,289 kilometers, being built in 1891 to 1916. And to close out for fun, let's talk about how the Russians are crazy fun people. Just like us Canadians, they like to do crazy things in the winter. For example, they've got the record for having the most amount of people going downhill on skis in bikinis. Oh yeah. And for me, I love it because, woo, I love my snow bunnies, as we call them. Now, this happened at the Sharagesh ski resort, and they said they had anywhere between 700 to 1,000 people. Now, here on FTD Facts, in our previous videos, we haven't talked about the provinces of Russia. And in Russia, they aren't really called provinces, they are called federal subjects. And Russia has a lot of them. They got 85 federal subjects. It's insane. Now, the largest of these subjects is the Saka-Yokohuchia Republic, which has 3,103,000 square kilometers of land. And out of these 85, 3 are considered federal cities, and Moscow has the highest amount of population, coming in at 10,382,754 people. However, if we want to talk more about the Moscow Oblast province, they would have about 6.6 million people. Now, out of all of Russia, within all these people, there are approximately 184 ethnic groups. And in 2010, a census showed that 81% are ethnically Russian. However, they also do have other groups such as Armenians, Chechens, the Chuvash, the Bashkir, Ukrainians, and Tatars, who are the biggest minority, making up 3.9%. Now, if you've ever heard of rhythmic gymnastics, you may know already that it was invented in Russia. It's basically an annual sport that they do. It features, I guess, rhythm and gymnastics. It's really quite cool. But as for the Federation of Rhythmic Gymnastics, it started in 1963. And since then, like I said, pretty much it's an annual competition within Russia. Now, in your own town, you've probably seen construction equipment that, in order to get through mud, they have tracks instead of wheels. But did you know that it was actually a Russian that came up with the idea of putting these tracks on a vehicle? Although the idea for continuous tracks came up the years prior, it was a man named Dmitry Zagreyatsky who attached the tracks to a carriage in 1837. And unfortunately, at that time, he didn't have the funds for a prototype, and he lost the patent 2 years later. And considering we're talking about inventions, we should probably mention the fact that firefighting foam was invented in and by a Russian inventor. His name was Alexander Loren, and he created it in 1902. He was a teacher in Baku, which at the time was a major oil hub for Russia. And because of all the oil accidents he saw, he was like, well, I gotta do something about this. He looked for a way to suppress oil fire and succeeded by patenting the foam in 1904 and even creating a fully functioning extinguisher that same year. Now, one thing that I was really shocked about is that I found out that Russia is a country that has the second highest amount of water out of any country in the entire world. Next to Brazil, Russia has 4,508 cubic kilometers of water. And the reason I found that weird is because I was always told in Canada that we had the most amount of fresh water in the entire planet, but I guess heck, Brazil has it, and then it's Russia, and then it's us. And when I talk water, I'm talking fresh water. And one thing that Russia has that contributes to this freshwater surplus is it is home to the largest freshwater lake in the entire world. And that lake is Lake Baikal, and she is huge. Alone, she contains 22 to 23% of the world's fresh surface water, coming in at 23,615.39 square kilometers. She is so big that if you took Canada's Great Lakes and America's Great Lakes and combined them all together, yeah, it wouldn't even equal the amount of water that's in this lake. And not only does she have the most water, but Lake Baikal is considered the world's oldest lake, being approximately 25 million years old. And although she may look skinny and nothing compared to the Great Lakes, she is currently the world's deepest lake, with an average depth of 744 meters to a max depth of 1,642 meters deep. And because of her importance, she is highly protected for pollution, and because of its importance, Lake Baikal became a World UNESCO zone in 1996. Now, one thing I really do love about Russia is they are pioneers in space exploration. And as a matter of fact, they were the first country to send a space station into the atmosphere. And in total, not including partnerships with the United States or other countries, Russia alone has launched 10 space stations. The first one being Salyut 1 in 1971, and the last one being Mir, which was sent up in 1986, which had the most days in space, coming in at 5,511 days. And following that, Russia allied with other countries like United States and Canada to create the International Space Station in 1998. Now, we've talked a lot about accomplishments of the countries, we talked about the land and all that, but what about its art? Now, we all know Disney and Warner Brothers in America are the cartoon mega hitters, but my question is there like a Disney in Russia? Like, they've got to have one, right? Well, animation has been a big part of Russian culture, with the first animator being theoretically Alexander Shiryaev, creating the first animation around 1906. Now, this was more stop-motion animation where he had doll ballerinas dance around on film. But the thing with Alexander, though, he never really put his films out there, and because of that, his gift to the world was never put into the light until he was rediscovered in 1995. But what about a mega hitter like Disney? Well, by 1935, things changed for Russia. This is because this was the first year of the Moscow Film Festival, and Disney had sent a small short of Mickey Mouse to the country. And because of that moment, Russians became interested in cartoon animation. And if we were to talk about one company that could be considered the Russian equal to Disney, that would go to Soyuz Multfilm, which was the largest animation studio in Russia during the Soviet times. It was based out of Moscow, being created on June 10th, 1936. And they became extremely popular, making shows for children and adding even a puppet division in 1954. At its height, it had over 700 employees and released 22 films a year, even 43 in like the 1970s. But because of its ties to the government, by the time the Soviet Union came to an end, the animation company suffered great losses. But by 1999, the government had refunded the company once again, however splitting it in two, one which secures and protects old films, and the other which is aimed to create new films.